Yes, and I believe that brings to a close questions for oral answer. I call on Government Order of the Day number 1.
Reform Bill, interrupted debate on first reading.
When the order, I ask members leaving the House please to do so a little more quietly. When the first reading was last being debated, the first reading of the State Sector and Public Finance Reform Bill, a speaker had concluded their contribution. I ask some honourable member, therefore, to seek the call, the Honourable Trevor Mallard.
Speaker, there's really a couple of points that I want to make, and I'll make the first point briefly, and that is that I think the Select Committee will have to look really carefully at the question of whether powers delegated to chief executives by this Parliament should in fact be sub-delegated to persons outside the public service. Mr Speaker, I think there's a clear implication, there is a clear understanding that where statute has given a chief executive a particular power, that should be can be delegated within the department, but not to someone outside. The second point, and more important point that I want to make, and make it by warning to Jonathan Coleman and to the Leader of the House, is to ensure that there is no implication in the government, or the government does not intend to ride roughshod over the Standing Orders Committee. Mr Speaker, it is the role of this Parliament to set some rules for department and for executives, but it is not the role of statute law to organise the running of this House. According to our standing orders, we have arrangements whereby we have reviews and we have estimates procedures. No statute that this Parliament passes can change those standing orders. And the difference is, sir, in the processes that we've agreed to in the past, the House does legislation on a majority basis, but the Standing Orders Committee does it on the basis of near consensus. So if a major party objects to a change, then that change will not occur. And I want to give notice at this point, Mr Speaker, that it is not the intention of the Labour Party to support a change in standing orders which would adversely affect the rights of this Parliament to examine the actions and the proposed actions of departments in the way that is being proposed by this government. Mr Speaker, the right to scrutinise the executive, the right to scrutinise departments is the main function of this Parliament. It is certainly the major role of opposition parties, and when there is a backbench from the government that is awake, it is part of their role too. And to suggest, Mr Speaker, that we will take away from members of Parliament effectively half their rights to scrutinise the activities of the executive and the government departments is something which is not acceptable. And I see the Minister is now listening to the debate. I want to repeat the offer from Chris Hipkins last night and to indicate to him that it is our intention, it's always been our intention in these state sector matters, to get legislation that will work whoever is in government. And Mr Speaker, there is part of this bill which we think is really good, there's part of it which we think is rotten, and there's some stuff in the middle which we might be able to be convinced on. While we will oppose this bill now, what I'm hoping for is a flexibility on the part of the government so that we can work together to get legislation around which there is at least near unanimity. I think, we won't We won't always get the entire House to agree with it, but what we've got to know is that whichever party is leading the government, they are relatively comfortable with the state sector legislation of the time, because you could be dealing with it basically at a month's notice. So, Mr Speaker, I want to emphasise to Jonathan Coleman that it is not the intention of the Labor Party to assist him to change the standing orders, to facilitate a reduction in the scrutiny of government, and he needs to take that into account when he considers whether or not he cooperates on this legislation.
Thank you. Just before I call the next speaker, to advise the House that this is actually a split call. We got a little bit out of kilter, so it should have been called from another side, but in this case it's already happened. So
Mr Speaker,
I call the honourable member Kevin Haig.